And what's really important about that number is we have to have the right market and pricing environment to provide the input, to provide the incentive for us to spend this money. And remember, us, when I say us, I mean the investors, because who invests in this development process? Well, it's our shareholders. Our shareholders are not going to allocate funds towards this investment unless they know there's going to be a return for that investment. Okay. A lot of times people think about pricing of pharmaceuticals. Why are drugs so expensive? Well, and one common answer I've heard, which is actually not correct, is that drugs are expensive because we try to recoup this cost of development. That's actually not quite accurate. The accurate picture is, in expectation of what we can sell our drugs for, we invest this money. We take the risk, we spend it over 10 years or 12 years or 15 years with the expectation that we're going to recoup some of these costs. However, once the drug is developed, we're not sitting there and pricing it to say, well, this drug cost $1 billion to develop, so we have to price it this way. Prices are completely determined by the value of the drug on the market. Sometimes we spend billions of dollars for drugs that completely fail. We've had one of those at Pfizer. We've spent billions of dollars on drugs that actually get approved but fail in the market. So do keep in mind that a free market environment and free pricing are essential to provide the incentives for shareholders and investors through us to go through this process to develop new medicines. At any point, if you decide that we are done, we don't want any new medicines, by all means go ahead and nationalize the industry, price things at marginal cost, and we're going to be done. If you need innovation, if we need better drugs for cancer, if we need better drugs for Alzheimer's disease, then you have to provide this incentive. This is how the system works. Now, the system is under a lot of attack. Intellectual property is sort of our bread and butter. It's what allows us to sell our drugs for a certain period of time without competition. And the process that exists right now allows generic companies to go and challenge our patents. And they're pretty aggressive about these patent challenges. Almost every Pfizer drug, for example, that exists has some litigation associated with it to try to provide, to allow generic companies to enter the market. So we are under increasing pressure. This is particularly relevant for legislation that's taking place right now about follow-on biologics. Some of you may have heard about the fact that there's legislation to try to allow generic companies to produce molecules, biologic molecules, generic biologic molecules, which is a new class of really innovative drugs. It's essential that whatever legislation is passed, and we are for it, that it provides for guarantees of certain exclusivity periods that will provide the right incentive for us to invest. So, one thing that we should keep in mind as time goes on, we think about health reform and how much money we're spending on health, is what's going to happen to this drug component. Now, again, this is only 10% of healthcare spending, so whatever happens here is not going to have a huge impact, but it's still 10% is not chump change. And this is an independent forecast of what's going to happen to the growth of drug spending in the United States over the next 5 years. And as you can see, it's pretty much flat. Okay? Again, many of the things that are contributing to this include the fact that there are more generics on the market. We are litigated against, and generics do come on the market pretty fast, which is good for consumers, but you have to remember to weigh that balance between access and lower prices because of generics and providing the right incentives for us to invest to produce new medicines down the line. So I want to go back very briefly to the very initial slide, which was that we represent 10 cents on every healthcare dollar that's spent in the United States. My guess is, and again, you can ask yourself this question, whether you thought that this number seemed too low or not. And it probably seemed too low for many of you. Most people, when you ask how much do drugs represent out of the healthcare dollar, they would say, well, probably 30%, 50%, 40%. And part of that is that the degree of cost sharing, when you go to the pharmacy to buy a drug, the degree of cost sharing is actually pretty high relative to the price of the drug and compared to the degree of cost sharing that you have to pay when you go to a doctor's office or you go to the hospital. So out of pocket, drugs represent a big budget item for most patients, in contrast to hospitals and doctors. And this slide just shows you what's been happening to copays, which is what you pay at the pharmacy when you pick up a drug over the past 8 years or so, compared to what's happened to actual drug prices. And you can see copays grow much faster than drug prices. This little slide just also relates to copays, and it actually shows you that for a lot of people, the level of insurance that they have is not particularly adequate. So those two columns represent the percentage of the top 100 drugs for which patients pay either 75% of the cost as a copay or 100% of the cost or more as a copay. So sometimes you actually go to the pharmacy and the copay that the insurance company says you have to pay is actually higher than the drug's cost. So again, this allows this perception to continue that drugs are very expensive, that they play a huge role in our budgets, and they represent a huge drain on our expenses, whereas it's mostly an artifact of how the insurance system is set up in this situation. Finally, the last fact that I'll mention, and again related to insurance, is that health insurance premiums have been growing relatively fast. Again, relative to earnings, relative to national health expenditure. So again, there's a patient perception that health expenditures are growing very fast. Part of it is that the degree of cost sharing, the degree that comes out of our pockets as patients, has been growing faster than the actual cost sharing, than the actual health expenses. So to wrap up, a few takeaways. Pharmaceutical spending is slowing down, and it makes up only a small proportion of our health spending in general. We are in a very risky and expensive business, and the only way to maintain this risky and expensive business is to provide the right incentives, and the right incentives take the form of market pricing for a certain period of time. We're an innovative industry that generates a lot of important jobs, well-paying jobs, jobs that attract highly educated people, and can generate a lot of economic growth, both at the state and the federal level. And that we are to some extent a victim of the perception that we are extremely expensive, and that's partially because out-of-pocket expenses tend to be a much higher proportion for pharmaceuticals than for other health issues. And to close, I was going to tell a funny story, as you know, now everybody's completely stunned by 10 charts. And this story had to do with this famous curve that we learned about in graduate school, where you know, as you raise tax rates, the amount of revenue the government collects declines. And it's a really funny story, but for the life of me, I couldn't remember what the name of that curve is. So I'm gonna leave that to my the people who are going to follow me in this panel. And thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.